Okay, it's 12 p.m. and I would like to welcome you to the ELEEP virtual discussion on water scarcity in California with our special guest Andrew Ayres here today with us. So first let me introduce to you the ELEEP network. For those of you who don't know ELEEP, ELEEP is the Emerging Leaders in Environmental and Energy Policy Network. It's a transatlantic group of young professionals in energy and environment, and tackles all kinds of environmental and energy related issues, be it renewable energy, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, water quality, water scarcity, and of course there's a lot of overlap between these issues. And I'm Max Grunig from the Ecologic Institute in Washington, D.C. We're one of the three hosts or partners of the ELEEP network. The other partners are the Ecologic Institute in Berlin, in Germany, and then there is the Atlantic Council, also here in Washington, D.C., where I'm also located. So I want to welcome everybody to this session, wherever you might be, whether it's midday, noon for you, for people on the East Coast in the United States, whether it's early breakfast time in California or even very early breakfast in Alaska, or whether you're in Europe and it's already later in your day. Today we talk about water scarcity in California. I think the issue as such, I mean, most people know that there is water scarcity in California, and most people have some ideas about it, but even people who claim to work or who work in the environment and water field and in policy and public policy very often don't have very deep knowledge about the reasons, the underlying reasons for that water issue, for the water challenge in California, and what can be actually done about it. And I'm really glad that we have here today with us Andrew Ayres, who is a PhD candidate at University of California in Santa Barbara. And as you can guess, his research concerns the economics of river basin management, and his primary focus is on the formulation and impact research of legal and economic institutions that encourage sustainable and efficient water use. Andrew's current work examines institutions for groundwater management, specifically the conditions under which property rights are adopted. The goal of his project is to inform the implementation of California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which may entail management changes in critical basins throughout the state. I want to add also that previously Andrew worked with me actually at Ecologic Institute in Berlin. So thank you, Andrew, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, just one comment. So you can, of course, ask questions either if you're on the Google system. We have the group chat, or you can email us. Best is to email me at max.grunig@eius.org, and you can contact us that way. And of course, I look forward to your questions later on. You can also in between ask questions if you don't understand something that Andrew is presenting. Sorry, Andrew, now it's your floor.
Okay. All right, thank you, Max, for the great introduction. Right now, I'm going to load up my presentation. Okay. So today I'm going to be describing research that I've been pursuing as part of my PhD dissertation. And this is what I'm presenting today is joint work with Eric Edwards from Utah State and my advisor Gary, who's also at UC Santa Barbara. So first, I'll give you guys some highlights of what we're going to talk about today. First of all, California presents a really nice opportunity to study the management of common pool resources, because for decades, groundwater users have been able to choose which, if any, management to adopt in their basins. Importantly also, California has critically overdrafted groundwater basins that are as yet unmanaged. So just briefly, we're going to use a theory that predicts that common pool resources begin to be managed when the benefits of doing so exceed the costs. Importantly, provided that agreement can be reached on what those management institutions should look like. Our application is going to be to groundwater basins throughout California. Some high value aquifers have been adjudicated, which means property rights have been assigned, while others have not. And our results indicate that tiered levels of management stringency in California can be explained using a theory of common pool losses, but also that resource and user heterogeneity explain bargaining costs that sometimes block management from being adopted. To get started, California faces an interesting puzzle. The figure on the left here has a lot of red dots strewn across the state, each of which indicates a monitoring well that over the last 5 years, which has been a pretty epic drought, have seen declines in water tables of greater than 10 feet. These are ubiquitous across the state. However, this phenomenon is not necessarily new. It's been going on for decades, as you can see in the figure on the right. This shows that ever since the 60s and even before then, the Central Valley has been pumping groundwater at unsustainable rates, declining water levels precipitously. Overall, this could be up to 15 to 20% of the total groundwater storage in the Central Valley. This has some adverse impacts, such as subsidence, where the ground level starts falling as a result of water being pumped out of the aquifer. Or in coastal basins, seawater intrusion, where seawater is drawn into a freshwater aquifer, ruining the water quality and ruining the basin potentially forever. The puzzling aspect of all of this is that despite these ubiquitous signs of resource stress, management responses across California have been far from uniform. Some basins have done a lot, and others have done basically nothing. To explain why this is the case, let's take a step back and talk about the management of common pool resources in general. So common pool resources are those in which each user's use of the resource, or in this case, each user's extraction, affects the health of the resource as well as other users. But it is difficult or costly to exclude other people from using the resource. The result is systematic over-extraction from the resource, and in extreme cases, a complete depletion of the resource, also called the tragedy of the commons. Now, to avoid this, new institutions are needed. These can be as informal as local social norms, or quite formal, like legal property rights, assigning rights to those who have a right to use the resource. Generally speaking, theory suggests that these institutions are adopted when their benefits exceed their costs. But if some users end up losing out from the transition to management, they may try to block progress. And as such, the process of formulating new institutions takes on a fundamentally political character. Groundwater is exactly a common pool resource just like this. In fact, it's one of the most ubiquitous local common pool resources across the globe. 30% of total freshwater withdrawals are made from groundwater, and over half of the world's megacities are critically dependent on it. As a common pool resource, it's subject to these over-extraction effects under open access regulatory regimes. In other words, when no one's stopping people from using the resource. Indeed, also formulating management institutions to groundwater has proved difficult in the past. And this brings us to our research agenda, which is to answer three main questions. Which basin and user characteristics explain the adoption of management? What determines the difficulty users will have in reaching agreement? And more generally, when and why do basins adopt management? This is important because there are few empirical investigations of bargaining costs in the management of common pool resources. From shared fisheries, there's evidence that actually very successful and skillful fishermen oppose the transition to management because they do better than everybody else under open access regulatory schemes. Also, for shared oil resources, widespread misunderstanding or lack of information about who owns land over what parts of the aquifer, over what parts of the shared oil resource actually inhibit the formulation of management institutions as well. For groundwater, however, we have studies showing that there are losses, but we don't understand very well how groundwater management institutions evolve over time. Second, California adopted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014, which will result in changes to management institutions in many basins across the state. We hope that this work that I'm going to present today can inform the successful implementation of that legislation. So right now, let's take a look at what exactly rights and regulation look like in California for groundwater. The underlying legal framework for using groundwater in California is called the correlative rights doctrine. Essentially, this means that if I own land over the aquifer, I can drill a well as deep as I like and start pumping as much water as I like, so long as I put it to beneficial use. This is important because the correlative rights structure retains important open access characteristics. There's no cap on how much anyone can pump, and there's no mechanism for forcing pumpers to take into account the effect that they have on the resource and other users. There are two major alternatives to the correlative rights doctrine in California. The first is groundwater management plans. Any implementing agency in a basin can draft a groundwater management plan, and they may have authority to do things like dictate how closely wells can be spaced to one another, or to levy fees on users in order to purchase replenishment water and recharge the basin. But importantly, they may not restrict or redefine water rights. As a result of this, groundwater management plans are sort of an intermediate management step, and they usually result in only very weak controls. The other alternative is very stringent management through court adjudication. So adjudication entails the users in a basin bargaining amongst themselves in order to come up with essentially a scheme of property rights that they all can agree to. Now, this should solve the problem because it's going to cap the total amount of pumping in the basin. And if that's the case, why doesn't everyone just adjudicate? The answer is because it's extremely costly. All of the users in the basin have to agree on what the new management regime should look like. And if some users lose out from the management regime, it can be very difficult to get them to agree and come on board. This is what we want to study today. To get an idea of what these management institutions look like across the state, we have the following map. So the adjudicated groundwater basins in California are shown in purple. They may cover an entire basin or sometimes several together. They're concentrated mainly in Southern California, but they can also be found along the coast and one in Northern California. Meanwhile, in blue, we can find the groundwater management plans throughout California. These can be smaller than a basin, and a basin can have multiple groundwater management plans. Those basins that are not shown here have adopted neither of these remedies and are still operating under the open access correlative rights doctrine. That's important because there are 307 of them out of California's 430 total basins. Finally, the basins here outlined in red are those that have been identified as critically overdrafted by the state, but yet have not been adjudicated. These will be key for our analysis later on. Very quickly right now, I'd like to walk through our conceptual model. First of all, for the benefits of management. For a basin to implement management, the total aggregate benefits have to exceed the total costs. And this is so that anyone who loses out from management could be compensated. The sense is this: under an open access regulatory framework, everyone is pumping at will, and this is not socially optimal. Groundwater levels are being drawn down. By implementing management, users hope to restrict excessive pumping to something closer to a socially optimal level, and they'll gain benefits from this over the long term. We develop an analytical model, and from that we derive the following predictions, namely that the aggregate benefits of management are increasing in 5 key variables. The first is hydraulic conductivity. This is a measure of how easily water flows throughout the aquifer. When hydraulic conductivity is higher, each user has a larger effect on other users, and thus the benefits of management are greater. The second is essentially the scarcity of water. When water is more scarce, it's more valuable, and so the benefits of management will be greater. The third is well density. When wells are more dense, pumping from one well affects the ability of another well to pump water from the aquifer in a more adverse way. So if we have denser wells in a basin, then the returns to management are higher because you will be restricting your neighbor's pumping. The fourth is simply more valuable uses. So if each unit of water is valued at a higher level, then the returns to management will be higher. In our case, this usually refers to those who want to use groundwater for drinking water purposes and have a high valuation of it, relative to agricultural users who have a relatively low valuation. And finally, management benefits are increasing in the risk of collateral impacts, which for us is going to mean exposure to seawater intrusion. So those along the coast, those basins along the coast should have higher benefits of management. Now we're going to shift to an individual perspective, from a pumper's individual perspective, to think about bargaining costs. So as I said before, some resource users will probably gain from management while others might lose. The benefits of management must be positive for at least some number of users in order for management to be considered. So now some basins are going to be in such critical condition that everyone is on board with management right from the get-go. But that's usually not the case. Usually some people will lose from management in the sense that they incur greater costs from having to reduce pumping than they gain from reducing the pumpers of others. In these cases, either side payments or costly negotiation over the institutional rules that are to be adopted will be necessary in order to bring them on board. We propose that these bargaining costs are increasing in 2 key variables, one of which is simply logistical costs generated by the number of actors or the size of the basin. So as you have more actors or a larger basin, it'll be harder to bargain over new management institutions. And second is anything that causes greater dispersion in the distribution of these private benefits. So another way of thinking of that is if you have a big gap between the people who benefit from management and the people who lose, it will be more difficult for them to reach agreement on what the institutional framework should look like for management. These are our predictions, and now we can turn to some empirical evidence to test them. But first, our data. We have measures of physical characteristics of these aquifer systems, such as how much rain is falling, where it's falling, how large the aquifer is, and importantly also what well yields look like in the aquifer. And well yields are important because they proxy for hydraulic conductivity, which was one of our determinants of management benefits. Additionally, we have some measures of the users themselves, including their locations. So we know how many wells there are within a basin, what percentage of them are used for drinking water, how dense the wells are, and importantly, how many wells are within 1,000 meters of the coast, because this will tell us what percentage of the users in a basin are exposed to seawater intrusion. And finally, we also measure the urban population growth over the past few decades, because this is proxies for increasing water value over time. And then finally, we have measures of our dependent variables, which include which management level has been adopted by each basin, and in the case of adjudicated basins, how long it took them to adjudicate. All this together should allow us to test some of our predictions statistically. So I'm going to explain right now our empirical strategy in a nutshell. First, we use a statistical model called an ordered logit model to assess what causes basins to adopt more stringent management. We tier the management as no management, GMPs, and adjudication. And then we use our determinants of benefits to explain why a basin lands in which tier it does. After this, we turn to bargaining costs, and for that we have two approaches. The first is that we use the critical yet unadjudicated basins in California as a counterfactual for adjudicated basins. The idea here is that if both of these sets of basins have similar benefits of management, we hope that our determinants of bargaining costs will explain why the critical basins have not yet adjudicated or really adopted any sort of stringent management at all. Our second approach is to look just at the adjudicated basins in California and assess what explains how long and costly the adjudication is. This is important because some of these adjudications have lasted decades and cost millions of dollars in legal fees. So finally now we will turn to some results. There are a few things to take away from this graph. Each one of these bars represents a level of benefits for these basins that have been derived from the data. So the gray line and the black line across indicate thresholds which must be passed in order to adopt a certain level of management. So the leftmost bars indicate what the benefits would be like for an average basin in California. And importantly, they're not even close to adopting a GMP because they're below the gray line. And this makes sense because 307 out of California's 430 groundwater basins have adopted no management. The next thing that's important to notice in this graph is the sign or the effect of each one of these variables on the benefits of management. So in the dark blue, well yields, which proxy for hydraulic conductivity, have a positive effect. So does well density, and so does urban population growth. Those are in dark blue, red, and light blue. Meanwhile, greater precipitation in green and a higher percentage of agricultural wells, remember, who have a relatively low valuation of water, actually reduce the benefits of management. So the last thing really to take away from this is the relative importance of each of these variables in determining the benefits of management. For the adjudicated basin far on the right, urban population growth is a major determinant of the benefits of management and basically takes it from a basin that might not want to adopt management at all to wanting to adjudicate because the value of the water is not only high, but increasing over time. The final takeaway here is that all of these results are consistent with our predictions from our model of the benefits of management. This table presents the same results in a different way. If you go to the last column on the right, increasing the average urban growth rate in any particular basin by 1 standard deviation reduces the probability of that basin not adopting management by almost 10 percentage points. And it increases the probability of that basin of adjudicating by almost 4 percentage points. Now, this is actually quite substantial because the underlying probability of a basin adjudicating is only 10.3% in our data set. So all of these variables potentially have large effects on the benefits of management and thus the likelihood of adopting management in the first place. So now we're going to move on to bargaining costs. Recall that in our first approach, we wanted to identify 2 groups of basins with similar benefits, but one group which had not adopted management. And so we've been successful here. The first row in this table indicates that based on our model of benefits, the critical basins in California that are not adjudicated and the adjudicated basins have levels of benefits that are statistically indistinguishable and indeed almost exactly the same. So what can possibly explain why the critical basins have not yet adjudicated? That would be bargaining costs. So we look at our bargaining cost variables and we find that the unadjudicated critical basins are systematically larger, they have more users, and they have more heterogeneous water demand. So I should mention here that our measure of well heterogeneity is the percentage of drinking wells multiplied by the percentage of agricultural wells. So when the mix is very even, that variable attains its maximum. So we find that, again, these basins are systematically larger, have more users, and have more heterogeneous users. So this provides a really good start for our analysis of the bargaining costs involved in formulating new institutions. Now we're going to move on to the second part of our analysis of bargaining costs. We're going to look at just the adjudicated basins, and we're going to try to determine what impacts the length of the adjudication. And we've got some pretty good variation here, as you can see in this graph. Some of these durations have been only 1 year, a very easy adjudication that was probably not very costly. And others have taken over 15 years and cost tens of millions of dollars in court costs for all parties involved. So now to remind you of what our predictions are for bargaining costs. We believe that both the number of users as well as the size of the basin will increase the logistical costs of bargaining, and so they should lead to higher bargaining costs and thus a longer adjudication. The same is true for anything that increases the dispersion in the private benefits of management. So this could be spatial variance in recharge to the basin. So if I'm located in an area that gets more recharge, it's less likely that I'll support management because I'm not facing low water levels. Again, well heterogeneity, because this creates disparate bargaining positions between those who want to use groundwater for drinking water and those who want to use it to irrigate crops. And finally, the proportion of wells near the coastline is going to create disparate bargaining positions. If you have a contingent of pumpers right near the coastline and a contingent inland, they'll face very different incentives because only those near the coastline are exposed to seawater intrusion. So I'll spare you the statistical details, but our results indicate that long durations are statistically associated with high well heterogeneity, more wells, and larger basins. So this confirms our results from our first approach at assessing bargaining costs and is also consistent with our model. Meanwhile, and importantly, looking at the adjudicated basins makes clear that coastal proximity behaves as expected. So basins with an even mix between coastal and inland pumpers tend to have long, drawn-out adjudications. And this is because those on the coast push for adjudication, while those inland don't want to restrict pumping for the benefits of others. Up until now, I've described a lot of statistical results, but it's also good to illustrate some examples of how these critical basins have been blocked from adopting management by the bargaining costs that we're talking about here. The first example is the San Joaquin Valley, or the Central Valley of California more generally. This area, this groundwater basin in California, has experienced some of the worst drawdown in the state over the past decades. And it has failed to adopt any stringent management measures. So why is this? Well, first of all, it is the largest basin in the state by far, and it also has the most users of any basin in the state by far. But the kicker for this groundwater basin is the heterogeneity of the users. Fresno and Bakersfield are large metropolitan centers, and rural communities throughout the basin are reliant on groundwater for drinking water. On the other hand, agriculture is widespread. The Central Valley is an agricultural breadbasket of California, but also of the nation. So this creates very disparate bargaining positions for groundwater users. Those who are reliant on groundwater for drinking water would like to keep water levels high and be able to rely on the groundwater resource at a fairly low price for a long time into the future. On the other hand, agricultural users face a very different incentive. When drought hits, as it has recently, they are cut off from their surface water supplies because there's no water flowing in the rivers. They want to be able to turn to groundwater and pump it unrestricted in order to irrigate their fields and keep their orchards alive. These very disparate bargaining positions have blocked the formulation of stringent management institutions in the Central Valley. Our second example is the Salinas Basin, which can be seen here on the left and runs all the way from the Coast Range Mountains all the way to the coast. The entire basin has been identified by the state as critically overdrafted because groundwater levels have been falling and contamination has been rising. So although the entire basin would benefit greatly from an adjudication or more stringent management measures, only those near the coast have succeeded in adopting stringent management. Outlined in purple, you can see the extent of the seaside adjudication. So these users in seaside actually were able to adopt more stringent management measures without involving the inland users. They economized on bargaining costs and solved the problem for themselves. Although both the inland users and the seaside users would benefit more from adjudicating the entire basin because it is interconnected hydrogeologically, the users in Seaside had to economize on bargaining costs and were only able to adjudicate the area around themselves. This is a good example of how bargaining costs dictate what level of management can be adopted at any one point in time. So to conclude, our empirical results provide strong evidence for our conceptual framework of both the benefits of adopting management as well as bargaining costs that might block management. They provide insight into when parties will seek to remedy common pool losses, in this case for groundwater aquifers. But on a more practical note, our results can also help to inform the implementation of California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act by identifying where returns to management are likely to be high, but also where agreement will be elusive. One important implication regards adjudication. Recent legislation that has been adopted in California aimed to streamline the adjudication process. It requires that each adjudication actually cover the entirety of the basin. However, it's conceivable that this could actually complicate future management because it will stop users from economizing on bargaining costs by forcing them to adjudicate an entire basin and involve all users, like they did in Seaside. In Seaside, they adjudicated only part of the basin because that's what they were able to do. So finally, discovering ways to form management institutions efficiently will be key for a successful and efficient implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and more broadly for the sustainable management of groundwater resources in California in the future. So thanks for listening, and I guess we'll take questions now.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, I can hear my echo. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I thought that was extremely interesting to see also the methodology, the mix that you had of rather a policy and then actual economics, and where you actually bring together these two worlds in a very exciting way. I found it also interesting to see that you find this disconnect between city residents, city politics, and the rural areas / farmers that we find in many policy areas, which is so interesting because obviously people in the city rely on the agricultural produce to survive, frankly speaking, but they don't seem to view this as an encouragement to come to a consensus or a compromise on the sharing of water resources. I think I see that not only in California, but in many places where water is scarce, where it's a very self-oriented perspective of the individual users. And of course, we know that there's many reasons for that, but it's interesting that you can actually see that in the data and that you actually prove that this heterogeneity of the users is an impediment to getting an agreement. And I also found many of the other aspects very exciting. I have one question of understanding first that I would like to ask.
Sure.
And maybe I just didn't pay attention quite right at the right moment. On your 11th slide, where you have the benefits, maybe you could show that quickly, and then we can go out of the slide share. Here, the unit, so you say ordered logic results benefits. Can you maybe explain quickly the what the benefits are? Are these monetary benefits, or how did you measure these?
So these are benefits broadly conceived to groundwater resource users. So these benefits are, at least from our conceptual model, going to be defined as the difference that in aggregate, users in, the benefits that the users derive from the groundwater resource over an infinite time horizon between a managed scenario where individual pumpers pumping is restricted, but the resource remains healthier as a result, and the difference between that and an open access scenario. So what we've done here is we've looked at which basins have adopted which level of management. And then we use our determinants, our theoretical determinants of benefits, in order to, through statistical estimation, find which benefits, which measures best explain the adoption of management. And so what the data tell us are that higher well yields, higher well density, and higher urban population growth have a positive impact on what level of management was adopted. And higher precipitation and higher percentage of agricultural users have a negative impact. So it's through statistical inference that we can say that these are the determinants of benefits. It's important to note that we haven't measured any monetary benefits here, but we use statistical inference to determine which of these variables explain the adoption of management on the benefit side.
Okay, great. One more question since we're on that slide. So just from my perspective, it looks like the negative drivers, so the reducers of benefits, the precipitation and the average yield. No, not the average yield.
Percentage of agricultural users.
Oh yeah, sorry. These seem to have relatively minor impact. Is that even statistically significant? Because it's pretty small.
Yeah, so in terms of statistical significance, I mean, these are illustrative cases that I've shown here. I have regression tables in the appendix that I can show you, what the estimated coefficients are on each of these variables. But they are statistically significant. Importantly, not for precipitation. And this was actually a very interesting result for us, because going into the project, you would imagine that the level of precipitation would have a very large impact, especially on the level of benefits, especially when you consider the fact that in Northern California, it's very wet and basins have a lot of recharge and people are not particularly reliant on groundwater, compared to in Southern California where it's very dry and groundwater is an important source of both drinking water and irrigation water. Those coefficients are not statistically significant at the 10% level. So it's possible that precipitation actually does not explain the variation in management adoption very well at all. On the other hand, the percentage of agricultural wells is actually a statistically significant explanatory variable for the adoption of management. So, I mean, these coefficients are all net coefficients. So the fact that those are negative imply that as they increase, benefits are reduced. But you're right in the sense that the data that our inference from the model and from the data indicate that these other drivers of benefits are far more important. For example, the average urban population growth is a far more important determinant of management adoption than either precipitation or percentage of agricultural wells.
Great, thank you. I think this is really, really exciting findings because, well, if I can summarize this in lay terms, that means actually how much water is available isn't that important in the end. That's at least not a key driver here.
Mm-hmm. I would say that you're right. The relative scarcity of water as measured by precipitation is not a particularly good explanatory variable here. What's more important is how valuable that water is to the users in the basin. So you could have a very dry basin, but if no one in there is using the water for anything valuable, it's very unlikely that the benefits of management will be high, and it's very unlikely that they will adopt management. On the other hand, even if you had a wet basin, but the demand for water is extremely high, that's a great driver of the desire to adopt management.
Great, thank you. Maybe we do have some questions from the audience. If you would want to ask your questions, you can do it in the chat, or you can email me. I can also check whether you email to the Gmail ELEEP account. I didn't see that before, but I'll check that routinely just to make sure we don't miss anything. Otherwise, you can use the chat function if you're in the Google system, or you can email me to my personal address. Again, it's max.gruenig, Gruenig, @eius.org. Otherwise, I would have a question, Andrew. It's going a little bit beyond the research you've done, which is really exciting, but just asking further more on the issue you mentioned before, that if you assign a value to the water and have defined property rights, there can be then, as a result, a push towards growing more valuable crops, or, as you put it, more valuable water uses are preferred then, which links, of course, then to the willingness to pay of the user, which we can also include the city people, because, of course, per liter, a household has a higher willingness to pay than a farmer. I also see risks with that, yeah? And we've seen that in some areas where, you know, farmers switching to kind of exotic crops that have maybe less relevance for nutrition or, you know, food supply for the population, and are maybe more export oriented and are maybe more, I mean, can be also non-food crops in that sense. What do you think? What can be done to mitigate this? Or should we, from a purely economics perspective, actually not mitigate it and just let it go?
So there's a lot in that question. I suppose I would start out by saying, I think you're spot on in that we, through the adoption of property rights to groundwater, users make it possible for them to trade water amongst one another. And in the end, one of the hopes of this is that, as you mentioned, water will be, in general, put to more efficient use as it leaves low-value uses, such as growing alfalfa in the desert, and flows towards either municipal use or the use and agriculture for more valuable crops. As that happens, we may indeed observe farmers switching towards crops that expose them to more water risk. As you've mentioned, so orchards are a big thing in California now. They've been adopted both in the Central Valley as well as elsewhere across the state. And one result of this has been that actually this, as you mentioned, increases the risk to farmers substantially. During this drought, we've seen agricultural users come out onto wholesale water markets, usually for surface water and not for groundwater, and start outbidding municipal users for water, because if they don't water those orchards in any particular year, they could lose a decade's worth of investment in whatever crops they're growing. So you mentioned risk, and I think there's two countervailing forces here, right? One might think that after exposing themselves to this risk, agricultural users would want to adopt more stringent management measures in order to make sure that in the long term, there's water there for them to irrigate their crops in times of drought. However, what appears to be, at least from our data and analysis, a bigger driving concern for agricultural users is the fact that when drought hits, they don't have, most of them who have junior water rights to surface water are going to be cut off from their irrigation diversions from rivers and lakes, for example. As a result, they want to have the option. So this is in economics jargon, they want to have the option. So there's an option value of being able to switch over to groundwater and pump in a relatively unrestricted manner. So if you think about it from the perspective of an agricultural groundwater user, sure, management might benefit them in the sense that there's going to be more water around and the water table is going to be higher, so that pumping costs will be lower. But it actually might expose them to more risk, because in the event of a drought, they would be restricted in how much water they could pump. Or if they wanted to pump more water, they might have to buy it from somebody else. So they really like, oftentimes, having the opportunity to switch over to groundwater immediately in the time of a drought and pump as much as they need without having to ask anybody or pay anyone for it. And so this is a reason why, although they're exposed to more risk, they might actually want to block attempts to implement stringent management.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew. This is exciting because, you know, first, without thinking that much about it, you would think that the risk actually pushes for then these safer harbors of the agreement where you know what you can get because it's defined. But you're right. If you define it, you actually limit yourself, so you expose yourself to this risk of losing the right to pump as much as you can.
Right.
That's a very exciting, very interesting, counterintuitive maybe, or less positive situation, because it makes it definitely harder to find agreements if the farmers really reflect on their situation. Just one thing, Andrew, you can close your slideshow and go to your own. You can stop the screen sharing, then we can see your face again. Perfect. Yeah, sorry.
I'm back. Okay, go ahead.
No, I have more questions, but if you wanted to say something on that, then go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm back here.
Great. Because I wanted to see, I mean, in this model, in the research you've done, you take the users mostly, I mean, because you use past statistical data, the users don't really have a lot of, they're very rational. You don't really have to consider their motives or their thinking, because you take the numbers from the past, you don't do forecasting, you don't go in the future. But I was wondering, just if you look forward to maybe future research, and then it would be interesting to also consider the expectations of farmers about the future, and especially discounting in general, and then also, of course, expectations regarding water scarcity, precipitation levels, seawater intrusion, and how much this actually could also factor into a tendency to enter maybe agreements or to not enter them.
Right.
And maybe you will continue your research on that. So I wanted to ask you basically about the next steps.
All right. Okay. So I think you bring up a good point, right? Which is that in our conceptual model, right, groundwater users are rational actors, and they're acting in their own best interests, at least as we've modeled their incentives. I think that when you think about water use, especially in agricultural areas, there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, there are farmers in the desert in California growing alfalfa who will tell you that they're growing alfalfa because their parents grew alfalfa and because their parents' grandparents grew alfalfa. So there's a strong sociological aspect associated with how to choose water and whether to manage it, or how to manage it, that I think about a lot, but is not part of my dissertation right now. So that's very important. And moving forward, I have another research project ongoing in which we try to, again, statistically, identify the benefits of adjudication by looking at agricultural land values. So we believe that, I mean, at least theoretically, that an adjudication should increase agricultural land values. And we try to identify this using statistical models. And so that project is ongoing. And in the future, yeah, I hope to do more work on how the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act can be implemented effectively and efficiently. And I think a large component of that I didn't really touch on today is the level or lack thereof of information regarding groundwater in California. You know, we have fairly good measurements of groundwater levels and groundwater contamination in the adjudicated basins, precisely because those are high value basins and people will pay to gather that information. However, in other basins, a lack of information actually inhibits reaching agreement on new management institutions. And this is a direction I'd like to take the research as well, because from the literature that we have on bargaining costs in the management of common pool resources, we know that information asymmetries and uncertainty can actually block the formulation of new institutions. However, finding a good way to measure or conceptualize a lack of information on groundwater, at least in a model that then you could use to test some hypotheses, has been, well, elusive to me at this point. So that's something that I might hope about for future research.
That's a very good point, because obviously you have different kinds of farmers. You mentioned family farmers, and they of course are very large farming, well, organized farming corporations, and that obviously have access to better data, better information, better modeling even, and who can really take bets and maybe hedge their bets and also get insurance, whereas other farmers might really just rely on whatever then in the end the government hands out if there is real need. So yeah, so it's really exciting. So you mentioned that maybe you will remain in that research field. Is that your plan?
Well, to be honest, I'm entering my 4th year of my PhD right now, and there's a good probability that I will be on the job market this year and finish my my dissertation this year. And then if I'm so lucky, I might be able to stay in California and find a way to continue working on these issues. So yeah, that's a hope of mine.
Yeah, great. And of course, we have a lot of ELEEPers in California. I hope they can listen to this. If they missed this this webinar today, then maybe they can see the recording later on. Maybe they can get in touch with you. If they have any questions, they can always contact us at the ELEEP network, or they can figure out how to get in touch with you directly, also not rocket science. And of course, I hope we can stay in touch. I've just been to California a few weeks ago, and we'll go back there in October. One of our other former colleagues, I think you remember her, Tanya Srebodniak.
Of course.
Yeah, she's at the Claremont colleges at the Harvey Mudd Hickson Center.
Okay.
And her focus is not water scarcity, but she works on environmental issues. So I would very much love to connect you as well. It's not that far. I mean, it's...
Right. Oh, I know. I went to Pomona College, which is one of the Claremont colleges. So I know exactly all about Harvey Mudd. That's
great. Yeah, it's very interesting. And she just started, I think, a little over a year ago. And it's great. There's a conference there on October 8th. It's a Saturday. Mm-hmm. It's on, I think the title is something like Sustainable Design. I don't know the title right now, but you can look it up. It's probably going to be really interesting, and I'll try to be there as well.
Ah, okay, great.
Excellent. Well, if there are no more questions from the audience, I don't think I received more questions right now. Andrew, do you have any questions or any comments to close off the session?
I suppose just in the context of the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's a lot of work going on to figure out how that can be done in a way that works for groundwater users, because they're all being asked to generate management institutions by themselves before the state threatens to step in. There's a lot of work being done there, and it's important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, any solution that's met for any particular basin should take into account the disparate bargaining positions and the disparate incentives faced by the users of the basin, and should be sensitive to that and not sort of a one-size-fits-all application of groundwater management. Now, Sigma intends to do this, but it's important to maintain flexibility for each basin including sometimes redrawing the lines within that basin, if that's what's necessary. And doing so will allow us Californians to more efficiently manage probably our biggest water asset in the state, because when all added together in aggregate, groundwater provides orders of magnitude more storage than all of the reservoirs throughout the state, all the dammed reservoirs throughout the state. And this is particularly important when one considers that climate change is going to make precipitation in California much more irregular, or at least that's what's projected. And storage, either behind reservoirs or more importantly in groundwater, can play a key role in sort of attenuating the negative effects of climate change.
Great. Well, that was a great closing. And I think, yeah, that's very important to see that water scarcity, yes, but if you look at the availability or the storage potential, it's of course huge, it's considerable. We also have to, of course, think about feeding rainwater back, replenishing the groundwater table. So there's a lot to think, a lot to do. I mean, if you go to LA and you see the LA River, the concrete channel that takes as much water as possible as quickly out into the ocean, yeah, you can get tears in your eyes, because, I mean, it's great for the fish in the ocean, right? But it's all lost. So yeah, let's get water back into the ground. And but thank you, Andrew. Thank you for your research. I think this is really important. I'm really impressed by the depth of the research. And I really hope we can stay in touch. And I wish you good luck here. Or maybe you want to mention the conference next week where you'll speak here in DC.
Yeah, absolutely. So this presentation in this webinar was relatively non-technical, and I'll be giving a more technical presentation of this at a conference for International Water Resource Economics Consortium that'll be held at the World Bank next week from the 11th to the 13th of September. So that'll allow me to get more feedback and polish up my last chapter before I hopefully really head out on the job market.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you to our viewers. I hope it was exciting. I hope you heard what you expected to hear and maybe even more. I hope you learned something. I hope you got a little bit of an appetite to hear more. And well, let's stay in touch. See you at the next webinars. And I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you and goodbye. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.